Kia ora koutou katoa, e hui tahine, e tēnei rā, greetings and thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Richard Smith, I'm the Director of the Resilience National Science Challenge. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the science webinar on the topic of tourism and COVID-19, opportunities and challenges for rural communities. We have two speakers this morning from the Resilience Challenge Rural Programme, Dr. Caroline Orchiston from the University of Otago and Dr. Jo Fountain from Lincoln University. The session is planned as two about 15 or 20 minute technical presentations. Each presenter will introduce themselves and then we're aiming for about 15 minutes at the end of the presentations for some Q&A. So there's a Q&A function available in the meeting. Please use this at any time throughout the webinar and upvote any questions that you see from others that you want answered. Keep an eye on that window also for any resources that we post links to in there and also links to the feedback survey at the end of the session. We're recording today's webinar and we'll make a copy available along with the presenter slide decks after the event, and we'll also send out a link to that. Now I'll hand over to our first presenter, Dr. Caroline Orchiston, who's the co-leader of the Resilience Challenge Rural Research Programme. Caroline.
Kia ora everyone, tēnā koutou katoa, ki te noho ao ki te maru o Ngāi Tahu, ko kapu kā taumahaka, taumanga, ko Aotearoa no Oti aho, ke te whariwānanga o Otago aho I mahi ana. Nō reira tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Greetings everyone, welcome along to today's webinar. I'm the co-theme lead of the Rural Programme alongside Professor Tom Wilson from the University of Canterbury. And today Jo Fountain and I are going to talk about some of the research that's underway and has been ongoing through the Resilience to Nature Challenges programme over the last few years. So I've been doing research as a hazard social scientist on aspects of disaster risk, response and tourism resilience over a number of years, and I'm really excited to share with you some of the work we've been doing on the resilience programme. So I think what I'll do is start off with a summary of the RNZ rural programme, just to contextualise where we sit within the broader programme. And then I'm going to talk a bit about pre-COVID in terms of the tourism and rural contexts in New Zealand when we were producing our first tranche of work on RNC1 starting off in 2016. And then I'll touch on the work that we're doing on the second tranche of work from 2019 to 2024. And then I'll hand over to Jo Fountain to talk about the implications and opportunities being presented by COVID for rural New Zealand. So here we are in the Resilience to Nature Challenges programme. It's a very interdisciplinary programme seeking to develop deep partnerships and transformative science to really accelerate New Zealand's resilience to natural hazards over the coming decades. And rural sits within a programme of within 10 broader programmes that cover a range of hazards and applied science and social science research. The rural programme is focused largely on agribusiness and tourism as two economic pillars in rural New Zealand over the last few years. And so today I'm really talking just about the tourism, but also agritourism opportunities that have been presented over the research in recent years. So the RNC1 programme, when it initially kicked off, we'd identified Kaikoura as a case study region, and within just a few months it had experienced its earthquake disaster in November 2016. So while we had to step back for a little while, we were able to go back in, and Nick Craddock-Henry and Frank Bulow from Manaki Whenua undertook a social ecological inventory of the relationships and the networks within the district of Kaikoura. And Jo Fountain also did some work there on tourism recovery marketing and tourist resilience as well in the weeks and months after the earthquake disaster. Throughout RNC1, our co-creation partnership with AF8, in other words the Alpine Fault Magnitude 8 programme, has been a really important partnership for us in terms of identifying emerging issues in emergency management and disaster risk and resilience. And our conversations with our partners really highlighted that tourist challenges are really major for civil defence. They find it very difficult to know who's in their regions day to day, and we're really asking questions about how the research, how academic research could help inform the way they do better response planning for future events. And so I'll talk about some of the work we're doing to fill the gaps in that space. And then the third pillar of tourism research from RNC1 was led by David Simmons and Jude Wilson at Lincoln University, which really aimed to try and understand transients, the transient populations of rural New Zealand in terms of tourists who are short stay right through the spectrum to the longer stay seasonal workers who live in our communities for months or years at a time. So in terms of the context of pre-COVID tourism in rural environments in New Zealand, leading up to 2015 and 2016, we were experiencing a period of very rapid growth, culminating in a peak in about 2018 of 3.8 million visitors per year, international visitors per year. So year in March 2019 rather, international tourism was generating about 16 billion of direct value added, representing about almost 6% of GDP. Domestic tourism at the time contributed about $23 billion, but it was much less visible at the time and perhaps less valued, I think, by the industry compared to what was considered the high value international market, which has come into interesting contrast in recent months as a consequence of COVID. Also at the time, New Yorker 2018 spotlighted the over-tourism issue that was happening globally, also known as the Lord of the Rings effect here in the article. Over-tourism was a real issue. In New Zealand, there was a lack of environmental, social and cultural sustainability, which was addressed by the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment in December 2019 with their report, which really called for a major overhaul of the tourism industry to protect its environmental and cultural integrity. And our rural communities were really at the coalface of these issues. There was pressure from freedom camping, from accusations of dangerous driving by international visitors. The Airbnb sector was displacing local residents from housing, and housing costs were rising. So many argued that we'd gone for volume over value, and that low value tourists were leaving too large a footprint in rural New Zealand and across the whole country. At the time, we had 3 international destinations in the South Island, the glaciers, Aotearoa Mount Cook and Piopiotahi Norfolk Sound, which had all reached a million international visitors per year, all of them in rural, peripheral areas with very high disaster risk. So rural communities are exposed to disaster risk. Consider, for example, the critical infrastructure that often passes through highly exposed areas, through mountainous and landslide prone terrain, for example. We have had cascading and or compounding disruptive events across some of our rural communities. If you think, for example, the Huranui drought from 2014 to 2017, which was on the back of the Canterbury earthquakes and those indirect consequences for the district and the region, followed by the earthquake in November, and then of course the biosecurity outbreak of M. bovis in 2017. So these are compounding events which really start to have a significant impact. And what we see are consistent themes emerging around social capital, adaptive capacity in rural communities, and the impact on personal resilience in some of these places that have been hit several times by compounding hazard events. And then in the tourism context, of course, we have visitors and temporary residents, who are in these places and are largely unaware of the risks and the emergency management arrangements in those local communities. In some places, there are very high proportions of tourists to residents, and for example, Franz Josef, resident population of about 330, and can host up to 4,000 or 5,000 pre-COVID on a busy summer's day. So real issues for local communities who then have to respond during a crisis. And non-tourists and locals, tourists and non-locals, putting a significant burden on the host communities during the crisis, and inevitably attracting a lot of media attention, which puts pressure on response agencies. So in that context of pre-COVID, we built the program for 2019 to 2024 with a focus largely in the second tranche of work on tourism governance, risk assessment and recovery. And it has been quite a simple case of pivoting, I guess, to COVID. I really hate that expression, but we have moved to address some of the issues being presented by COVID in this context. So one of the, as I mentioned, AF8 was a key part of the co-creation process that we went through during Tranche 1, and it led to some really interesting tourism research opportunities. Back in September of 2019, this is Tom Wilson, the co-theme lead for rural, we arranged the tourism forum, so AF8 hosted it down in Te Anau, and we had Penny Hinare, who is the Minister of Civil Defence and also the Associate Minister for Tourism at this event, which was quite an exciting moment for us. We had 110 tourism stakeholders in the room with our civil defence partners, and for many of these tourism operators, it was the first time, their first experience of considering a disaster scenario that we presented there on the day around the Alpine Fault scenario, and many of them found it very thought-provoking, judging from the feedback that we received. So we heard many calls for research to support their understanding of tourism mobility around the South Island, and to assist to help them with response planning from that tourist perspective. And so Matt Darling's work has really filled this gap in terms of trying to understand transients and disaster risk exposure around the South Island. He's using volunteered geographic information such as Instagram and TripAdvisor commentary and other novel data sets to model visitor movements. He's capturing tourist mobility through a network of data sensors that he's put in place across the South Island, which was very timely because it managed to capture the COVID crash and now the recovery as things start to build again from the tourism context. And so I'll share with you some very preliminary data that Matt gave me just last night. I'll step you through these 4 images, and so top left we have Franz Josef Main Street over the course of 24 hours along the x-axis. And so we can see early morning and then the peaks starting to come in. Now these peaks are from the pinging of cell phones within a 300-metre radius of a sensor. So he's really picking up some nice detail of people movements through the community, through the township of Franz Josef there. Then in contrast, picked in here, we have a period of 5 days. These 2 peaks are Friday and Saturday, leading into the weekend. This is a non-school holiday time. It was in late July, and so you can see these peaks, if you look closer, really start to mimic the arrival of ferries and the movement of people through the eyesight following the ferry arrivals. Then down here in Milford Sound, again, we've got a 4-day period in early October, and this is the school holiday season. So you can see 2 sort of bimodal peaks here related to the arrival of the ferry at 10 o'clock in the morning, and then again at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. So a nice sort of symmetry, I guess, there in terms of the ferry arrivals at the terminal. And then Queenstown, we've got 2 days here. This is the day on the 6th of October, and this is the 7th of October. And that assures me that this day was an 18-degree, stunning spring day, in contrast to a rather chilly grey day here. And he argues that people were out and about in a big way thanks to the nice spring weather. So what this data helps us to understand or observe visitor movements through time. It develops a picture of each destination's particular signature of visitor mobility, and it really helps us to understand tourist exposure, time of day, the diurnal patterns of movement that we observe, which will really help us do better response planning for future disasters. Then another PhD student, Lucia Danzi, a wonderful Italian student, she applied for the scholarship that we advertised, looking at tourism and emergency management and disaster resilience in rural communities. And she's taken on this project and she's absolutely thriving. She's already completed a systematic review, and now she's taking a really deep dive into policy and policies in terms of the tourism and civil defence policies and plans across the national and regional levels to really help understand the collaboration, information sharing, knowledge building that's going on between tourism and civil defence, because we know that there are some issues there in terms of them not being that well meshed together. She's then going to embark on a network analysis, and all of this work will help to develop a framework that integrates tourism into the 4 R's of emergency management. And Mariah Osborne is a quite core-funded but strongly aligned student doing her Masters at Otago with James Hyam and myself. And she's initially, the plan was for her to undertake a survey of tourism operators around the Southern Alps from a seismic resilience perspective, a bit like the work I did about 12 years ago, so replicating some of that. But COVID came along, and so she shifted to a qualitative method to interview senior managers at RTOs across the South Island to understand the impacts of COVID, how RTOs have prioritised the government funding, and whether or not they're starting to think more strategically about their role as destination managers as opposed to marketing agencies for their regions. So this is really exciting. It looks as though there's a lot more emphasis coming on the management aspects of their roles at RTOs, which is really exciting. And then 2 other students based at Lincoln University, focusing much more at the level of the resilient tourist. So Lydia Michaela is looking at domestic tourists in the conservation estate, and she's working with Joe Fountain and Stephen Espiner and Nick Craddock-Henry. And Aviva is doing her Masters looking at Chinese tourists, their risk perceptions and awareness and preparedness for natural hazards on the West Coast. So some really exciting research coming out of the rural program. These slides will be shared if you want to go back and look at in any more detail at some of this material, or just contact us afterwards and we can easily have a conversation with you. But in the meantime, I'd like to hand over now to Joe Fountain, who's a senior lecturer at Lincoln University. Her research is focused on social scientific analysis of resilience in rural regions, with a particular emphasis on agri-food networks and agritourism as tools for resilience. Take it away, Joe.
Thank you for that introduction, Caroline, and thank you to all of you who have come along today to listen to this webinar. As Caroline said, we're very happy to share information afterwards. If you have any questions, either ask now or contact us afterwards. So, as Caroline said, my involvement in this rural space comes from a range of different contexts. So I've been involved in research in North Canterbury for since about the Kaikoura earthquake. And my interests are really around food producers, wine producers, and farmers. And I've been working in particular with New Zealand wine growers and with beef and sheep farmers in North Canterbury, as well as with food and tourism operators. So just on this slide is a couple of a bit of a context in terms of the research I've been doing and how it comes together in RNC as well. My slides are not moving on now, everybody. So So if we go back to thinking about COVID-19, obviously Caroline's talked about some of the additional vulnerabilities that rural regions have during times of natural disasters around infrastructural links and so on. But actually, in the context of COVID-19, things were sort of the opposite for many rural regions. So for many parts of New Zealand, while urban areas were experiencing a very different life, people either working from home or not working at all. In the case of rural regions, the majority of the workforce were often essential workers. So the first lockdown occurred right in the middle of the wine vintage and harvest. And all of those workers were seen as essential workers, as were the other food producers and horticultural producers. And so, for example, in a place like Huranui district, 2/3 of all the workforce continued as normal during lockdown, being essential workers. I think the other thing that's quite important when we think about tourism in rural New Zealand is that many of the tourism providers in these regions have diverse income streams. So again, you think about a wine producer, they have numerous distribution strategies for their product often, maybe supermarkets, restaurants, and then they may have a salador, and alongside that they may have a walking track or accommodation or other ways to make money. Similarly with farmers, for many farmers, tourism is just part of a diverse portfolio which incorporates also sheep and beef and dairy and planting trees and maybe bringing in honey. And farmers of all people in New Zealand are incredibly used to the challenges of fluctuating prices, fluctuating markets. So, you know, exchange rates, milk solid prices, all of these things are fluctuating. So in some ways, I'm very lucky with the tourism providers I'm working with that most of them have a number of other income streams. So most of the people I'm working with haven't been entirely devastated by COVID-19 with regards to their tourism businesses, although I acknowledge that for many people that has been you know, really devastating. Some other implications about tourism for rural New Zealand is that, as many of the people watching today will be aware, there are a number of government tourism support packages which are having an impact in rural New Zealand. So some of the first announcements were around those strategic tourism assets. And so just in the top of the south, we have Kaikoura, Whale Watch and Dolphin Encounter, both identified as strategic tourism assets. There's also been $20 million spread to the regional tourism organisations more recently to help them with destination management and planning. So a lot of this money is going not just to immediate marketing, but also to developing tourism destination management strategies and plans looking forward. And then there is funding also for domestic, but for individual businesses as well through various funds. Now, in all of this, obviously in New Zealand, we are seeing a need to pivot to domestic. And while Caroline has said she hates the term, I actually find the term quite interesting. So some people have said, well, pivoting, it's just a fancy word for change. But if we think about pivot in the context of basketball, where it's used quite often, it's not just about change, it's about having to immediately flip what you're doing in the face of obstacles. So I think in the case of COVID-19, what we are seeing is businesses, regions, destinations having to turn on their heels, turn on the spot very quickly to face this new reality. And so what is this new reality? Well, some of you may have seen presentations by me before and you may be familiar with this slide, but I think there are a range of things going on that are having immediate impacts on people's interest in tourism, domestic tourists, what they seek when they travel. Obviously, for many people, this is a time of economic uncertainty, not just in New Zealand, but globally. But I'd argue that there's also a sense of maybe a post-lockdown zeitgeist, kind of an attitude that many people seem to have come out of the lockdown with. So while the lockdown was devastating for many people, for businesses, for mental health, for some people, it was a time to reassess and revalue what was important in their lives. And so the article on the top there was an article of New Zealand Guardian readers talking about what they liked about COVID-19, or at least what they enjoyed about the lockdown and what they hope to see change in their ways of life after that. And I think some of these things connecting to the economic recession and this post-lockdown zeitgeist or attitude can be summarised in those four things there. Connecting to roots, connecting with nature. Connecting to roots is about understanding our heritage, connecting with our families, connecting with our country's heritage, connecting with nature. We've seen lots and lots of imagery and talks on social media about all the piwaka waka, how nice it was to hear bird song. But the two I'm going to focus on a little more now is around simplicity and this idea of search for slow and loving local, loving home. So, and I think these concepts are really useful when it comes to thinking about the way forward for tourism in rural areas. So just focusing in on that sense or search for slow, and the quotes in the boxes there I won't be reading, but they are from that Guardian article I highlighted before. I think many of us during the lockdown found ourselves with a bit more time to perhaps explore our neighbourhoods, spend time with our families, which was nice at the start and perhaps became less so later on. But also, you know, the cooking. The day before lockdown happened, everyone was rushing to shops to buy broccoli seeds and broccoli plants. You couldn't buy them anywhere because everyone was planting vegetable gardens, baking bread, making chutneys. And I think, you know, valuing that time and taking the time to do things slowly, whether that's slow travel, slow food, you know, cooking from scratch, biking, walking, all of those things seem to have taken a greater priority. And a second trend here was very much apparent during the lockdown, this emphasis on loving local, living local, loving local, being part of a team of 5 million, supporting local businesses, and also those new ways of working. We're still hearing a lot about being, you know, proud of being part of a team of 5 million. And I think there is that sense that whether it was the teddy bear hunt or the number of New Zealand flags that appeared in my neighbourhood, that there was a sense that we're all in this together, and I think we're still seeing a lot of that in the media. So Caroline's also already mentioned briefly the value of the domestic market. The domestic market has always been larger for New Zealand than the international market, but it hasn't had the same attention. And I think this diagram highlights sort of some of that information around the potential of the domestic market. So you've got there on the left-hand side the amount of money spent by New Zealanders on outbound travel each year, so about 9.3 billion. On the right, you have the existing amount of domestic travel in New Zealand, about 18 billion, so more than the international market. But I think the statistic up on the top right corner, which was presented to me in the Christchurch New Zealand Pivot to Domestic program, that for every $1 a Cantabrian spends on tourism in New Zealand, they spend $6 on an overseas holiday. Meaning that even if just a small amount of that that money that had been spent on overseas holidays was spent domestically, taking into account sort of economic uncertainties and other things to spend your money on, you know, there is a lot of pent-up demand and opportunities there. And the evidence to date does suggest that domestics are travelling. Last week, I'm slightly embarrassed as a tourism lecturer to admit that last week I went to Milford Sound for the first time. And in fact, I'm probably part of those statistics in Matt Darling's figures for Queenstown last week, because that's where I was. But yeah, there's a lot of people about. There's a lot of New Zealanders taking this as an opportunity to visit their own country. I included that photo there of the tourist sitting on a beach. You won't be able to read the subtitle, but it says, "Not Botswana, but not bad." And it was a story about a group that were going to be travelling overseas to Africa and have decided instead that they would travel domestically. And, you know, there's been a lot of articles written about the extent that Kiwis have been travelling during the last few months, particularly starting with those July school holidays. So if you look at the domestic spend for July, we've found that actually excluding Auckland, it's up in every region for the same time in previous years. So Otago, the West Coast, Marlborough, Tasman have all increased basically 50% more visitation without international visitors in July than they had in previous years. And this graph illustrates that as well. So you've got here a graph showing domestic spend. You'll see those fluctuations, which are obviously seasonal. So the peaks are around summer, Christmas, school holidays, the troughs with little sub-peaks around the July school holidays. And look at the figures for 2020. So obviously a huge drop in the first few months of the year, but the figures for July are higher than any peak season figures before 2017. Okay, so that's the July figures, and you compare that to previous year's July figures. So there is massive movement around the place. A report I suggest you all have a look at if you're interested in this is this report by Kantar. It is available on the Tourism New Zealand website, but it does look at forward projections for pivoting to domestic and for the domestic market. This study suggests that 64% of New Zealanders are indicating that they would like to travel or holiday domestically in the next 12 months. So close to 2/3, but there are some groups that are even more likely to be travelling. So the new migrants, 72% of them are going to take this as an opportunity to travel domestically. And again, the 30 to 49-year-olds, which generally includes those with families, are looking at having, are more likely to be thinking about domestic travel as well. But I think this table is really interesting as well, that even after travel restrictions are lifted, there's a good proportion of New Zealanders who are saying, well, for a while, I'm still going to holiday within New Zealand. I'm going to take this as an opportunity to see more of my own country, which is interesting as well. So moving on to why we're actually here, the opportunities for rural tourism. I think bringing together what we're already seeing around the domestic market, but also taking into account the post-lockdown zeitgeist, potential economic recession. I think in terms of rural tourism, there are a range of things that domestic visitors are wanting. They're wanting to connect to people, to heritage, to places, to their own heritage, but also to the heritage of New Zealand, either as new migrants getting to know about that heritage or as long-standing residents who have never really taken the time to go and visit these places. To socialise, I think many of us realised during lockdown how much we miss being able to share food and drink and stories with our friends and family. To learn and pass on learning, so an opportunity to develop new skills, passing on those skills to the next generation, and also coming out of this scheme of 5 million, the opportunities to support local businesses and also communities. And this it seems to be reflected in the report I was mentioning on the previous page. These are the top 7 things that New Zealanders are looking for in a New Zealand holiday. Visiting places they haven't been before. Still the landscapes. We know international visitors love the landscapes, so do New Zealanders. The third one has proved a bit of a challenge for many tourism operators, that budget-conscious nature of domestic visitation, that we don't want to pay international prices for our experiences. But looking down there, you know, visiting those iconic attractions, having good food and beverage experiences, and just being able to relax and refresh and have adventure and fun. So in terms of the North Canterbury area I've been working on, there are clearly already lots of examples of agritourism in these regions. So whether it's educational field trips, hiking and shooting in the mountains, Kaikoura Coastal Track, which is the first image, these businesses have been open to tourists for a couple of decades. And on the whole, particularly with walking and things like that, these private run walkways have generally welcomed more domestic visitors than international visitors. But we are seeing new businesses emerging at the current time as well. And again, my slides have stopped moving on. I don't know if anyone else can help. There we go. So glamping, Tawanui glamping. Lots of glamping sites setting up, but you know, really affordable for a family getaway or 2 families. There are two tents that you can get away with. But they're also offering opportunities to go and watch a dog round up sheep. I'm not sure how many people on this call are as old as I am and remember a dog show on Sunday night. How that's the highlight of many families' Sunday evening was watching a dog round up sheep. Well, this is your time to let your children experience that as well, potentially. Tawanui farm stays have also recently set up Energy Jet. And again, having lots of families going out and having fun and doing things they may not have thought of doing prior to COVID-19. Another success story in North Canterbury, the Middle Hill Mountain Bike Park, taking advantage of its beautiful location between mountains and seas. This park has been set up in the last year on a Clarence Valley farm. And again, attracting mostly domestic visitors with a group of friends who want to get out and explore the great outdoors. Moving on to thinking a little bit about the food and wine tourism. There has been a recent report that came out in the last month's issue of New Zealand Wine Growers, which has said that for many wine tourism operators, particularly the tour guides, they're having a really tough time. In Central Otago, for example, 90% of many of the guests on wine tours and even at Saladors had been international visitors. But they're also reporting that domestic visitors are coming to wineries, they're eating and drinking, and not only that, but while there are fewer visitors, they are actually spending much more time in the Saladors and also spending more. So it's a more satisfying experience to many of the hosts as well, that they're able to tell their stories and the visitors are more engaged and obviously are also more likely to be able to purchase the products on returning home without thinking about distribution costs and freight overseas. And having their own transport means that many of these tourists are free to travel at their own pace and explore new opportunities and experiences. I mentioned on the previous slide that actually a number of wineries have said that being able to offer seated tastings has provided a much more engaged opportunity. People are more focused on the experience. And one winery that is doing this really well is Terrace in North Canterbury. I think one of the things about food and wine tourism in the past is it's often been quite exclusive. So you know, not everyone can afford $110 for a crayfish. But what Terrace have done really well is they started offering what they called sort of luxury toasted sandwiches. So these are pulled pork toasted sandwiches, $11 each. So, you know, really affordable. It's not a big 3-course meal at a restaurant, which is quite hard to get children to sit at. They've also set up this seated tasting with food and wine matching, which is proving really popular. But again, just an example of the way in which the domestic market, there are many opportunities to maybe engage the domestic market in a way that the international market never had time for. So just a final couple of points. I think, you know, as Caroline highlighted before we headed into COVID-19, we were at a time of really feeling a lot of pressure in the New Zealand tourism industry with over-tourism, with freedom campers. And I think the tourism industry in New Zealand and many parts of New Zealand had really lost their social license to operate. You know, there were many communities saying, why are we doing this? Isn't there a better way of doing this? And I think Tourism New Zealand's exclamation, do something new New Zealand, while aimed at tourists, could equally be aimed at the tourism industry. How can we take this as an opportunity to pivot, to adapt, or even to transform the tourism industry? It is going to mean looking at new markets, looking at new products, thinking about new mobilities, new ways of travelling the country, particularly in the domestic environment. And with maybe, we've seen, you know, what happens with restrictions on air travel. It also needs to be acknowledged, though, that there are outcome inequalities, that different regions are going to benefit to a different extent from a domestic market. So we know that basically anywhere within maybe 3 hours of a major city generally does quite well, because people are still keen to take day trips, weekend trips, rather than those longer trips. Certain sectors are also struggling. Travel agents, tour guides, luxury lodges, these sectors are really struggling with adapting to the new environment. So we can't forget that while these may be opportunities for some, it is a real concern for others. But, you know, if we can think about doing tourism differently, this will have implications for livelihoods and also for well-being, and not just social well-being, but the well-being of our environments as well. So maybe it is time, an opportunity to transform the New Zealand tourism system, and to really address that question, you know, what is the value of tourism, and what do we value about tourism, and what do we value about the people and places where we live and play? So I'm just going to leave you with the thought that, you know, how can we ensure the economic viability of businesses in a way which enriches tourist experiences, but also can restore and protect landscapes and ecosystems and the social and cultural values of destination communities? And I think this is the time where we can start to revisit that. So thank you for your time. We are happy to take any questions you might have. And yeah, thank you for that.
Kia ora, ngā mihi nui. Thanks Joe and Caroline. There aren't many questions coming through, but the first one that has been published is quite a meaty one. I guess that was quite an optimistic view you presented, Joe, which is great. The first question from Gareth is sort of you know, asking a question that looks a little bit deeper, I guess, into community in terms of beyond some of the economic analysis. You know, what else might be happening to the less visible parts of the community and vulnerable components in particular. So yeah, if I just sort of read the closeout to that as a question statement, yeah, how do you think those vulnerable elements of a community, the unemployed, the disabled, elderly, geographically isolated, how have they been impacted, and what self-capacities or resilience might be enhanced in that context?
I'm happy to go. this one before I hand over to Joe, if you want to add something, Joe. But thanks, a great question. And I think obviously when you have a crisis like this, which affects one industry so severely, you're going to look at economic indicators of recovery. So of course we do that, but the work that we've been doing in communities is a lot more about the intangible sort of social and community resilience aspects. And in my observation of communities out there at the moment, I think they're becoming a lot more familiar with feeling uncertain about the future in terms of the disruptive events that might affect them, and sort of looking into themselves and going, what capacities have we got? What sort of collective responses can we muster here? And I think there's a lot of work going on which involves looking after those in the community. And we often see, you know, when there are events that affect isolated communities, they all chip in and they work together, and they don't leave out those that might be less able. So my view, and maybe it's a little rosy one as well, but I've seen this time and again where people really look after each other and much more of a collective response than is often seen in the public eye. Yeah, Joe, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, and it is a good question, and I'm not sure at what point it was posed. I did try and allude at the end to the fact that this is not affecting everyone the same, and there are, you know, deep and a range of underlying questions that still need to be answered. And I think one of the issues is, yes, there are people who are struggling, and growing more tourism is not the only solution. For example, in Kaikoura, the best way to develop greater resilience in Kaikoura is not to have more tourism or different tourism, is actually to have a wider economic, more diverse economic base as well. So yeah, I don't want to downplay the issues around isolation, the issues around sort of feeling disconnected from communities either. That's definitely a cause for concern. So and I think in revaluing or reassessing the value of tourism, it may be about saying, you know, it is about saying, well, what do we actually value as a community? And is there something else we should be doing instead of tourism in some of these places? Tourism is not the only answer here either.
Great, thanks, Joe. And Caroline, another question that's come through regarding environmental sustainability. Do you think digital heritage, digital preservation, and like virtual reality have a role to play in tackling the transformation?
Yeah, I think it absolutely does. And I think one thing that wasn't really touched on much today was the global climate, you know, crisis that we face, and the implications of that for a destination like New Zealand, which is obviously very distant from our main markets in many cases, the UK and the US, etc. And so I think these sorts of technologies have an absolutely, you know, critical role to play, but it's just that we're not quite down the track far enough to understand how to price that, you know, so that we aren't out of pocket as a nation in terms of, you know, pricing our heritage and our culture and our experiences through these sorts of VR kind of technologies. So I think, yeah, I think it's an exciting opportunity, and I think especially from the carbon emissions perspective, it's going to become increasingly important for people to use those sorts of technologies as opposed to going on a you know, an ultra long haul flight to come to New Zealand.
Yeah, I might have a slightly different approach to that. I think definitely there's a lot of scope for VR apps and so on to really add depth to our understanding perhaps of heritage and stories as a layer over the environment. So Historic Places Trust has done some really good work with apps that can tell stories as you're travelling through a place. I know there's one for Christchurch pre and post earthquake. But I think there is still something to be said for actually meeting real people and getting to hear the stories firsthand from the people. And I think another thing is, if we do focus a bit more on this idea of slow tourism, slow travel, maybe staying closer to home, maybe biking places, walking places, I think you can have longer experiences of tourism, you know, without the carbon footprint as well. So I think there's a range of different approaches. I do think virtual technology can provide many people with opportunities to experience things that they can't do face to face. But I guess also I'm researching food and wine tourism mostly, and it's a bit difficult to have a virtual food or wine experience. So I may be biased on that as well, but definitely going slower, staying closer to home. You know, you don't need to travel to Europe to have a week's holiday. I live in Christchurch. You can travel to Aotearoa, and you know there's enough to do to spend a week in Aotearoa as well. So yeah, just rethinking what a good tourist experience might involve.
Great, thanks, Jo and Caroline. In lieu of any other published questions, I might take the facilitator's privilege to ask a direct verbal one. I'm interested, you know, the research program has been progressing through, you know, a significant natural hazard event in terms of the Kaikoura earthquake and the impacts in North Canterbury, Kaikoura, Marlborough, and then now through, you know, massive global impacts in terms of COVID-19. I guess interested in what you're seeing in terms of either lessons from the natural hazard events for rural recovery in a COVID context, or vice versa, I guess, you know, what we're learning from COVID that might be relevant for future natural hazard events.
I might start with that one. I think it's definitely true that there's, you know, there are a range of hazards, and in many of the areas we're working on, it's layer upon layer upon layer of hazards. So COVID-19 for many of, particularly the farmers of North Canterbury, is just another thing. The interesting thing with some of the work I've done in the post-quake farming project is that farmers have told us that it wasn't so much the earthquake that made them rethink their strategy, their diversification strategies. It was actually the fact that the earthquake came on the back of 3 years of drought. So actually 3 years of struggling in drought followed by an earthquake, and a number of them said, you know, we just sat there and we went, there must be a better way of doing this. You know, there must be a way we can use our farm as an amenity value, for its amenity value. It may mean bringing other people in to do the beekeeping, or other people in to take hunting groups. But yeah, just completely rethinking their approach. And I think we find that sometimes these short, sharp shocks are often a trigger for transformational change. You know, we see that again and again, that it makes people reassess their values. The problem is that often as time goes on, it's very easy to just fall back into existing patterns of behaviour. As life returns to normal, people tend to go back to normal ways of coping. And we've seen that to an extent in Christchurch and also in Kaikoura. So I think this is a time to really sort of, you know, to really push on with some of those questions. What do we want to do differently? And actually, you know, put some strategies in place to ensure we're doing that. In terms of what COVID-19 is really interesting, because it was such a sudden event. You know, from my own experience as a lecturer, one day I was standing in front of 60 people giving a lecture, and I wouldn't do that again for another 6 months. You know, suddenly. And I think, you know, like an earthquake, there are these sudden shocks that change us, but then there are things like climate change, which is the sort of gradual onset, slow onset. And I don't know that we're I think we're quite good at changing our way of thinking with a sudden onset event. You know, we're all locked down, but for these longer, slower processes, I think there's a less well thought out response, perhaps around drought and climate change. I don't know if Caroline has anything to add there.
Yeah, I mean, I would just quickly add, because I know we're almost at time now, that you know, the disaster experiences we've had over the last decade have really taught us many lessons. And I would say that rural communities are really understanding that they may well be isolated, they may have to look after themselves for periods of time. We've done lots of work from an alpine fault perspective, looking at how to build, you know, better disaster planning and resilience into local communities. But that approach to planning can actually be used in a wide range of contexts, whether it be COVID, you know, local flooding, etc. And so, you know, for example, Milford Sound, after the big floods that they had in January, they'd been busy planning for an alpine fault earthquake. They'd worked collectively with a number of agencies trying to get better prepared, and they had a much better experience responding to those floods than they would have had they not considered an AF8 sort of planning strategy. So, you know, there's a lot that can be learned from planning for these big disruptive events that can be then sort of moved into whatever the context is that you're facing at the time.
And if I can just add to that as well. The work I've been doing with Nick Craddock-Henry in the wine industry, we found the same thing, that actually interviewing people in Marlborough as a result of the Kaikoura earthquakes, that the wine industry, when all of them said that, you know, part of the reason they responded the way they did in 2016 is because they had a series of earthquakes in 2013. So that they'd changed their practices around health and safety, you know, prioritising getting people out rather than saving wine, having new technology to help trace their staff. Yeah, just a whole lot of things. I mean, you know, we learned a lot in 2013 and we've learnt more in 2016. And so now going forward, we will be more resilient. And one of the things we've found really interesting is for some of the corporates in Marlborough, not only have the lessons they learned in the Kaikoura earthquake been important for New Zealand wineries, but has actually had an influence on the global culture of their company. So lessons learned in Marlborough for Pernod Ricard have had an impact on the way that the company responded to the wildfires in California as well, and the wine regions there. So yeah, so learnings don't have to just be place specific either. They can have sort of more wider and global reach too.
Great, thanks, Joe and Caroline. We've just got one last question from the audience. It's from David, and I guess it picks up a bit of a thread from earlier conversations. But if we're accepting that the future of tourism will be different from the recent past, what are the employment and transformation opportunities and needs for rural folk?
Just a small question to end the day. Wow. I think, again, just drawing on what we've just been describing in terms of the lessons learned over the last sort of 10 years or so, I think being adaptable, being agile, having really strong leadership, trying to increase your the sort of nature of the work that you do in terms of being diverse in the work that you do in rural communities. I think all of those things will have a contribution to building resilience into rural communities. Yeah. Joe, did you have any final thoughts there?
Yeah, I think one of the things I've found most heartening in the last few months is seeing the emergence of a lot of cottage industries and a lot of small scale producers. So I think they were originally called Made in New Zealand on Facebook page, where people were saying, well, you know, my husband's been building all these tables out of old pallets in the garage, and we thought we might try and sell them here. And the feedback in terms of, you know, New Zealanders buying New Zealand products has been really high. So I think there will be more opportunities for small scale operators. I think there is a shift away perhaps from relying on corporates. Again, how long this lasts, but there will be jobs. I think we will be looking for deeper experiences, seeing this as an opportunity for people to really engage in the stories and the culture and the environments of the country. Yeah, I think a lot's really uncertain. You know, I mean, probably in July July school holidays, we were all thinking that here we were on the other side of COVID, and so we realised that, you know, this is a long game, but I do think there are opportunities for jobs, different kinds of jobs available.
Great, thanks, Joe and Caroline, and yeah, thank you very much to everybody on the call today. We'll bring things to a close. Just a reminder to fill in the survey if you can. We really appreciate some feedback in terms of preparing for our next webinar. That's currently scheduled for February in 2021. Details on an exact date and topic to follow, and we'd really be interested in your views on the sorts of topics you'd like to see covered in the future. As we've noted, recording of the webinar will be available on our new YouTube channel and a link from our website, and also on that link, the slide deck from today's presentation. So thank you again. Ka nui tēnei, that's it for now. Kia pai tō koutou rā. Good afternoon.